Beneath the cornfields and quiet rivers of Iowa lies a forgotten world, one of ancient giants, sacred geometry, buried cities, and cosmic scars no one can explain. This isn't flyover country. It's a prehistoric riddle written in stone, bone, and silence. For every answer, there are five new questions. For every discovery, a deeper unknown. So forget what you thought you knew about the Midwest, because Iowa's past doesn't just refuse to be solved, it refuses to be understood. Welcome to the strangest 2 hours you'll never stop thinking about. This is Iowa Prehistoric Mysteries Science Still Can't Explain. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. These stories are just getting weirder, and you don't want to miss what's buried next. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight, noon, somewhere in between. Let's see how far this mystery reaches. 1. Why animal-shaped mounds? If you fly low over northeastern Iowa, preferably in a small, rattling aircraft built sometime during the Ford administration, you might see a bear or a bird or maybe something in between, but only if you're squinting and only if you're looking down at the rolling ridgelines near the Mississippi River, where the effigy mounds have slept for 1,000 years under layers of sea snow and speculation. To the untrained eye, they might just look like lumps. Elegant lumps, yes, curved, deliberate, symmetrical in their own oddly animalistic way, but still just dirt covered in grass, silent, and yet they're some of the most mysterious earthworks in North America. Unlike burial mounds or ceremonial platforms, effigy mounds were built in the shapes of living things: bears, birds, occasionally lizards or panthers, but mostly bears and birds, always these two, guardians of the earth and the sky. We know the builders belong to cultures we now group under the woodland tradition, but that's like saying you found a novel written by someone from Europe. It's vague by design. Archaeologists have assigned radiocarbon dates, mapped alignments, and found the occasional bone or pottery shard, but the truth is, no one actually knows who first decided to mold the earth into animals, or why. Were they burial sites? Some contain human remains, but many don't, so maybe not. Were they meant to be seen from above? Possibly, but from what vantage point? There were no balloons or drones in 900 CE. Perhaps they were constructed for those who lived in the ski or the underworld, or nowhere at all. Some researchers suggest the bear and the bird represent dual cosmic forces: earth and sky, winter and summer, inwardness and outwardness. Others claim they could have been part of a vast ritual map across the landscape, a prehistoric GPS, a terrestrial prayer, or an astronomical calendar designed for spirits who didn't care about time. There's something unnerving about that kind of ambiguity. We're used to mysteries with suspects, motives, endings, but these mounds just exist, quietly, persistently. They were built to endure, but not to explain themselves. The builders, whoever they were, left no known written language, no Rosetta Stone, no manual titled Effigy Mound Building for Dummies. What they did leave was a series of perfectly shaped animal forms, built out of thousands of tons of dirt in patterns we can't fully interpret, spanning hundreds of miles, all made without metal tools or beasts of burden. In other words, someone went to an awful lot of trouble to say something we still haven't translated. And what makes it more unsettling is that these shapes aren't just decorative, they feel intentional, like messages, warnings, invitations. But no matter how much LiDAR we use or how many papers we publish in regional journals no one reads, the animals just lie there, watching, waiting, laughing, maybe, or worse, mourning. But if you think these symbolic soil beasts are strange, wait until you hear about the perfect geometric cross that may or may not have existed in a nearby Iowa field, a place where history gets suspiciously symmetrical and skeptics start sweating. 2. The cross at the Folkert group. In the late 1800s, a man named Theodore H. Lewis walked into an Iowa field and promptly ruined archaeology for the next 150 years. He claimed he saw something incredible near New Albin, a symmetrical cross made entirely of ancient Native American burial mounds, 4 long arms, perfect alignment, north, south, east, west. In a word, suspicious. Lewis wasn't just some guy with a stick and an overactive imagination. He was working for the Northwestern Archaeological Survey, and in his 1894 notes, he mapped what's now called the Folkert Mound Group, dozens of earthen piles supposedly forming a cross so geometrically precise it would make Euclid weep. Fast forward to today, and we've got a problem. No one can find that cross anymore. Modern archaeologists have returned to the site with maps, GPS, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and enough skepticism to power a mid-sized think tank. What they found was, well, a lot of dirt, mounds, yes, but not a cross. Not a perfect one anyway. The arms are irregular, the direction skewed, and some of the original mounds may have been plowed flat, eroded away, or never existed in the first place. So was Lewis hallucinating? Did he mismeasure? Was he misled by local legends and the romanticism of the 19th century when everyone wanted to find lost civilizations under their own vegetable garden? Or, and this is where things get weird, was he right? What if the original design was a cross and we just lost it? The margins of history are filled with things that were once obvious and are now invisible. In the absence of photographs, all we have are Lewis's drawings and faith in our ability to trust a man with a pencil and too much enthusiasm. And here's the kicker. Cross-shaped mound groups do exist elsewhere in North America, especially in Hopewellian and Mississippian contexts, where alignment with solstices, cardinal directions, and cosmological systems mattered a lot. So the idea isn't absurd, but it's uncomfortable because it means someone was building massive symmetrical earthworks in Iowa and then either abandoned the plan, covered it up, or let nature reclaim the evidence. Or maybe, and this is the worst possibility of all, the cross was never for us to understand in the first place. You can bulldoze a mound, but you can't unask the question, why build a cross in the first place? Was it a cosmic symbol, a meeting point, a territorial marker visible only from the spirit world? The thing about prehistoric geometry is that it's rarely accidental and it never apologizes. And if you think a ghostly symmetrical cross is strange, wait until you meet its overachieving cousin, an ancient landscape packed with more than 100 mounds stacked so densely that even modern planners can't quite explain how it was all managed. If your brain's already spinning and we've only just scratched the surface, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. And while you're down there, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you on a midnight deep dive or casually unraveling ancient mysteries over breakfast? Either way, you're in good company. 3. Sny Magill's sheer scale. Tucked away in a quiet bend along the upper Mississippi River is a place that looks, from a distance, like any other patch of deciduous Midwest woods. But if you happen to scan it with LiDAR or wander it on foot with a notebook and an overactive imagination, you'll find yourself standing in one of the densest concentrations of ancient earthworks in North America. Sny Magill isn't famous. It's not marked by neon signs or narrated tram rides. There's no gift shop, but it contains over 100 mounds, most of them low, rounded, and quiet, sprawled across a forested bluff in patterns no one has fully deciphered. Some are linear, others conical, and some appear to form vague alignments, or at least they did before time and tree roots had their way. This is Iowa's largest known mound group. Bigger than effigy mounds, bigger than the nearby Folkert group, bigger than what you'd expect from a culture that didn't have metal tools, pack animals, or Excel spreadsheets. The big mystery? How? How do you coordinate the construction of more than 100 carefully shaped dirt structures, some up to 80 feet wide, without written plans, bulldozers, or coffee breaks? The logistics alone are baffling. You need laborers, materials, a shared vision, and most daunting of all, a reason. That reason remains speculative. Were these burial mounds, ritual sites, territorial markers, a calendar, a map, all of the above? Most of the mounds remain unexcavated, out of respect, but also because digging them up hasn't always answered more questions than it raised. When excavations have occurred, findings have been inconsistent. A few burials here, a fragment of pottery there, but nothing that definitively ties the entire site into a neat narrative. And this is where the questions multiply. Was Sny Magill built all at once, like some great coordinated sacred campaign? Or was it added to gradually, generation by generation, in an ever-growing accumulation of memory, like layers of song lyrics passed down until no one remembers the first verse? We also don't know who built it. Most researchers assign the site to the late woodland period, between 500 and 1200 CE. But again, late woodland is a placeholder term. It's a catch-all for cultures we don't fully understand, named by archaeologists trying to sort the past into filing cabinets. Whoever they weren't just making dirt piles. They were shaping the landscape in ways that required cooperation, vision, and time. Lots of it. That kind of effort suggests something serious was at stake. But what? Some theorists have wondered if the mound builders were in competition with other groups, using large-scale construction as a kind of cultural flex. Others suggest a more sacred rationale, that each mound was a monument to a person, an event, or even a spiritual being meant to preserve a cosmological geography no longer visible. Either way, the scale doesn't lie. Sny Magill isn't just big, it's disturbingly big, too big for comfort, really. The kind of big that suggests a deep order behind the surface chaos, an order we haven't yet cracked. And it's not just in the dirt. Look up. High on the limestone bluffs above the river, there's another message, fainter, redder, and harder to translate. This one's not carved into the land, it's painted onto the stone. 4. Paint rock pictographs. Climb up the bluffs that shadow the Mississippi River, and you'll eventually find a place where the stone bleeds. Paint rock, perched near the top of a steep cliff in Allamakee County, looks like any other outcrop of weathered limestone, until you see the red. Faint, faded, but unmistakably intentional. Lines, shapes, and figures painted with an iron oxide pigment known as red ochre. A handprint here, a zoomorphic blur there, a possible human figure mid-dance or mid-warning. These are pictographs, ancient images painted directly onto rock. And unlike petroglyphs, which are carved or chiseled in, pictographs are ephemeral, vulnerable. They fade with time, wash with rain, erode under wind. The fact that any still survive at all in Iowa's weather-prone, driftless area is something of a miracle, or a mistake of geology we've yet to fully understand. So what do the pictographs mean? That's the part no one agrees on. Some interpret them as religious symbols, iconography tied to shamanistic visions or spirit world journeys. Others suggest they mark seasonal migrations, hunting grounds, or tribal boundaries. And there are those who argue the images weren't meant for the living at all, but for the spirits embedded in the landscape. This, of course, is the archaeologist's nightmare. Symbols with no translation key. There are no written texts, no oral traditions that link directly to these specific figures, no deciphered sequence of meanings, just reddish shapes fading into a cliff left by people who clearly wanted them to be seen, but may not have cared who saw them. And the dating? That's another headache. Pigment can't be carbon dated directly. Instead, researchers analyze nearby organic material, lichen growth, or stylistic comparisons to pictographs elsewhere, like in Wisconsin or Minnesota. Estimates vary wildly. Some say 500 years old, others say 2,000. All we really know is they're old, older than the stories we can still tell. But here's the strangest part. Paint rock isn't alone. There are other pictograph sites scattered throughout the driftless area, like ghost towns of visual language. Some are inaccessible, some are lost, and some are protected by silence. A few have been documented, sketched, or analyzed in academic papers that sound scientific, but mostly read like organized guesswork. So why paint images where few people would see them, where weather would inevitably erase them, and where meaning would eventually slip into the abyss? That's the question. Maybe they were warnings to rival groups. Maybe they were prayers to cliff spirits. Maybe they were signatures, statements of presence from people who had no other way to be remembered. Or maybe, just maybe, they were part of a larger network of sites, cliff paintings, mound alignments, and hidden shelters that mapped not just the landscape, but the spiritual geography of the ancient Midwest. And speaking of shelters, just a few miles away, under those same sandstone cliffs, lie natural chambers where people lived, worshipped, and waited out winters for thousands of years. Their lives left only the faintest traces, hidden in the hollows of time. 5. Pilot rock, other rock art tucked away in the unassuming folds of Iowa's driftless area, is something so rare, so quiet, and so understudied that it might as well be whispering in a language only rocks understand. Welcome to the strange and scattered world of Iowa's prehistoric rock art. If the paint rock pictographs were a headline, then these are the footnotes. Hard to find, easy to ignore, and absolutely impossible to stop thinking about once you've seen them. The most famous example is Pilot Rock, a lonely, jagged sentinel standing in the wilderness like it just wandered out of a different century and forgot to leave. It's not just a landmark, it's a message board, a monument, maybe even a myth turned geological. Early records mention faint images painted or pecked onto the stone, symbols, shapes, maybe animals, maybe human figures, maybe just the wind playing tricks. Pilot Rock itself is dramatic enough without decoration. It rises like a fossilized memory from the forest floor, and it's been used for centuries as a navigation marker. River travelers reportedly used it as a guidepost, which raises the first mystery. Was the art meant to be seen from a distance, or up close, or not at all? Scattered across northeastern Iowa are other sites like it, less famous, less obvious, and even more enigmatic. Faint red smudges on sandstone overhangs, carvings half swallowed by moss, places you only hear about from people who start their sentences with, "Now, I'm not saying it's a sacred site, but..." The problem is these sites exist in the space between archaeology and rumor. Some have been documented in local archives. Some were reported in the 19th century by bored surveyors or overzealous antiquarians. Others are only remembered in passing mentions, lost in family stories, old letters, or half-deciphered field notes. When modern archaeologists try to locate them again, they're often met with silence. Either the art has eroded, or the records were wrong, or the entire thing was misinterpreted to begin with. But assuming at least some of it is real, and it almost certainly is, we're left with a tantalizing problem. What did these images mean to the people who made them? Rock art isn't passive, it's labor. You don't paint or carve onto stone because you're bored. You do it because something needs to be recorded in the most durable way possible. These were statements, prayers, warnings, invitations, dreams. We just don't know in what language. And then there's the problem of dating. Pigment deteriorates, lichen grows, water flows down the cliff face, carrying away the past in a slow motion landslide without direct evidence, charcoal for radiocarbon dating, tool marks that can be matched to specific cultures, organic material sealed in nearby sediment. We're stuck with educated guesses. So some say these artworks were made by the same cultures that built the effigy mounds. Others think they're older, or later, or layered. Centuries of images built up on the same rock face like prehistoric Pinterest boards. And then there's the weirdest part. Nobody knows how many sites are still out there, hidden on private land, covered by vegetation, eroded just enough to disappear from human sight, but not from memory. They wait, like echoes without a source. But while these ghostly artworks haunt the cliffs, there's another kind of shelter nearby, less symbolic, more practical, but no less mysterious. Deep in the sandstone ridges of Allamakee County, ancient people took refuge, and what they left behind tells just enough to be fascinating and just little enough to be infuriating. 6. Allamakee rock shelters. You'd think that if ancient people lived somewhere for thousands of years, we'd have a clear picture of how they lived, a tidy narrative, bullet points, maybe even a primitive user manual. But in the sandstone overhangs and bluffside caves of Allamakee County, what we have instead are shadows, charcoal, bone fragments, stone flakes, a shell here, a post hole there, barely enough to fill a museum display case, let alone explain a way of life that spanned millennia. These are the Allamakee rock shelters, tucked beneath weathered cliffs, hidden by trees and largely overlooked by everyone except the occasional archaeologist, hunter, or raccoon. From the outside, they look like something you'd find while lost on a hike, natural overhangs carved by erosion and time, but the inside tells a different story. Fires once burned here, tools were sharpened, food was cooked, families perhaps sheltered from the bitter winds of an Iowa winter or the blazing uncertainty of an Iowa summer. The archaeological record, such as it is, tells us people return to these shelters again and again. Some sites show use during the Archaic period, others during woodland times. There are signs of continuity and change, and yet even after decades of excavation and analysis, the full role these shelters played in ancient lives remains elusive. Were they seasonal camps, emergency shelters, spiritual retreats, temporary stopovers during long-distance travel, or trade? Yes or no, or sometimes. It depends who you ask and what kind of evidence you're willing to count. And that's part of the issue. The evidence is maddeningly uneven. Some shelters are shallow and exposed with only a thin layer of human activity. Others are deeper, richer, but harder to access. And even in the best cases, what survives is often fragmentary. A deer scapula here, a piece of fire-cracked rock there. It's archaeology as jigsaw puzzle, except most of the pieces have been swallowed by time, rodents, or a particularly nosy tree root. Still, the implications are enormous. If these rock shelters were key parts of seasonal rounds, they offer a glimpse into a mobile, adaptive culture that knew this landscape intimately. People weren't just surviving, they were thriving, making calculated choices about where to rest, where to gather, where to hide from the worst of the weather. But the shelters also raise a different question. How many of these sites have we lost? To erosion, to looters, to logging, to the slow bureaucratic shrug of underfunded surveys and maybe next year excavation schedules. What we see today is probably just a fraction of what once existed, and so the shelters remain stoic and mostly unreadable, tombs of forgotten routines, libraries with missing books, spaces that once held warmth, conversation, and purpose, now reduced to sediment and speculation. And if you think their silence is haunting, wait until you hear the muffled echo of a vanished city, a grid of earth lodges tucked into the low S hills where people built homes, lived their lives, and then disappeared. 7. Why so many earth lodges at Glenwood? There's something unsettling about finding a neighborhood where nobody lives anymore. Streets vanish, roofs collapse, doors forget how to creak. But in the Loess Hills of Mills County, Iowa, the vanished neighborhood isn't made of wood or brick. It's made of dirt, and memory. Welcome to Glenwood, a prehistoric suburb, minus the Wi-Fi and HOA fees. Between 1200 and 1350 CE, something unusual happened here. Dozens, some say more than 300, earth lodges sprang up across the valley. Thick-walled, semi-subterranean homes dug into the landscape with care and precision. These were not temporary shelters. These were planned, rooted, inhabited. Glenwood was never just a campsite. It was a town. And then, nothing. No war, no cataclysm, no epic legend of betrayal carved into stone tablets, just a fade. People left, and the place dissolved into the soil like it had only ever been a thought. The Glenwood culture is usually grouped within the larger Central Plains tradition, stretching from eastern Nebraska into western Iowa. But Glenwood is an outlier, a bulge on the map, a community that blossomed and vanished with little warning, leaving behind only earth circles and confused archaeologists. Why here? Why then? Why so many homes? That's the mystery. This particular stretch of the Missouri River's eastern edge wasn't especially fertile, at least not compared to surrounding regions. There's no evidence of defensive fortifications, no clear signs of a central religious structure, no massive cemetery, just a dense, well-organized cluster of homes that implies what? Trade? Family? A political experiment? A breakaway religious commune? We know the earth lodges were substantial, walls reinforced with wood posts, thatched roofs, clay floors, central hearths, built to last but not forever. Many are found under modern farmland, barely traceable until you fly over with thermal imaging or stumble across a patch of oddly compacted soil. Some theorize that Glenwood was a hub in a regional network, a gathering place during seasonal transitions, maybe a diplomatic center for distant villages. But all of that is speculative. The artifacts, potsherds, stone tools, food remains tell us what people used, not what they felt, not what they believed, not why they left. There are no known battles, no mass graves, just absence. That's the real weight of Glenwood, not the homes, but the hollow spaces where homes once were. It's as if a whole society tried something complex, social, maybe even hopeful, and then quietly decided it didn't work out. Maybe they moved upriver, maybe they fractured into smaller kin groups, or maybe they saw something coming, drought, disease, political shift, and left before the earth lodges became coffins. But if Glenwood was the city, then the backyard might hold the bigger secret. Because in one of these old footprints, archaeologists found a perfectly preserved house in someone's lawn. 8. Home life in a buried house. In the late 20th century, a couple in Mills County were just trying to landscape their yard, maybe plant some tomatoes, maybe put in a patio. What they didn't expect to find, buried beneath the topsoil of their quiet suburban property, was a 700-year-old house. Archaeologists later named it the Davis Oriole Earth Lodge, and what they uncovered was a domestic time capsule, so intact it almost felt rude to look at. This wasn't just a fire pit and a few potsherds. This was a floor plan, a memory map, a lived-in space preserved beneath centuries of silence and siege, roughly 25 feet across, circular, sunken into the ground. The lodge had 4 central support posts that once held up its roof. Around the edges were benches, storage pits, and areas for sleeping or working. In the middle, the hearth, not metaphorically, literally, charcoal still visible, burned bone fragments, ash that hadn't drifted since the 1800s. This wasn't just an archaeological site, it was someone's home, and that makes things awkward. Because now you're standing in someone's kitchen from 700 years ago, holding their tools, looking at the imprint of where they once sat, where they ate, maybe argued, maybe grieved. But here's the deeper mystery. While the house was well preserved, the social world it belonged to is gone. We can model how they stored corn. We can estimate how many people lived inside. But how was power distributed in that household? Who made decisions? Who sat closest to the fire? Who got the warm corner and who got the drafty one? And most importantly, why does no one live there anymore? The Glenwood culture didn't disappear in a blaze of glory. It left with a shrug. The Davis Oriole site, preserved by the collapse of its roof, gives us a cross-section of a moment, but no script, no answers, just a structure frozen in its final breath. Some archaeologists believe the household layout hints at egalitarian structures, no throne, no clear hierarchy. Others see the spatial divisions as signs of ritual or status. The storage pits were unusually deep, the hearth unusually central. Were they symbolic or just practical? And what does it mean that this lodge was found beneath a modern backyard? That beneath today's grill out and lawn chairs lies an entire world we didn't know existed until we literally tripped over it? We live atop forgotten architecture. Our neighborhoods are built over the bones of others. Their kitchens lie under ours. Their fires went out so ours could burn. But if a house can survive 700 years underground, imagine what else might be hiding just beneath the surface, like a fortified village that prepared for something, fought something, or feared something, and left the story half told. 9. Kimball Village's fortifications. Sometimes a ditch isn't just a ditch, and a wooden fence, that's not always just landscaping. In the case of Kimball Village, a National Historic Landmark near Westfield, Iowa, what looks like an ancient moat and a ring of upright posts might have been the prehistoric version of a panic room, or a statement, or a warning no one wrote down. Kimball Village belonged to the Mill Creek culture, thriving in northwest Iowa around 1100 to 1250 CE. It sits high on a bluff above the Little Sioux River, picturesque now, but in its heyday, this location wasn't chosen for the view. It was a fortress. The village had a palisade, a perimeter wall of sharpened wooden stakes. Around it ran a ditch, carefully excavated, and within the enclosure, a dense cluster of earth lodges, hearths, trash pits, and storage areas, all organized with what looks like intent. It wasn't chaotic, it was a plan. So the question is, why the fortifications? One theory is conflict, that the villagers needed protection from rival groups, from raiders, from neighbors who weren't feeling neighborly. But here's the catch. There's no direct evidence of battle. No mass graves, no scorched remains, just the quiet suggestion of preparation. Another theory leans towards ceremony or status. In many indigenous traditions, enclosures weren't only for defense, they were also for defining sacred space. A palisade could be symbolic. The ditch might not have been dug out of fear, but out of respect for whatever rituals occurred inside. And then there's the third option, both. Maybe Kimball Village was a place where practical concerns and spiritual ones overlapped, where a community organized itself around the idea that the sacred and the dangerous lived on the same street. We know the people who lived there farmed corn, hunted bison and deer, and made elaborate pottery. Their ceramics, especially the Mill Creek type with incised decorations, show technical skill and aesthetic care. Their tools, carved from stone and bone, were specialized, some for cutting, some for scraping hides, some for shaping the world. But what we don't know is how they saw themselves. Was the village a defensive outpost, a religious center, a tightly knit community preparing for the worst, or just the most organized people in the region? The palisade and ditch have been mapped, studied, digitally reconstructed, but they don't tell us whether they ever did what they were built to do. Were they deterrents, stage sets, security theater? Whatever the answer, Kimball Village stood for something, And then, like so many others, it was abandoned, quietly, no fanfare, just a slow fade into the hills. The posts rotted, the ditch filled in, the story turned into speculation. But if you follow the trail long enough, past the fortifications and the hearths, you'll find a bigger question, not just how these people lived, but what became of them. 10. What became of Mill Creek people? One day they were here, the next they weren't. The Mill Creek culture once sprawled across northwest Iowa, villages perched along rivers, fields of maize rippling in the wind, networks of trade humming quietly across the prairie. And then sometime in the 13th century, the lights started going out. There's no single event that explains it. No invasion, no smoking crater, no climate apocalypse that left clear scars in the soil, just a slow, uneven vanishing, like a song that fades out instead of ending. So what became of the Mill Creek people? That's the question that makes archaeologists lean forward in their chairs. There are clues, but no confirmations. Many scholars suggest a cultural transition, one that links Great Oasis, an earlier semi-sedentary tradition, to Mill Creek, and then forward into the Middle Missouri tradition, which eventually fed into historic Mandan and Hidatsa communities further north. This chain is not airtight. It's not a straight line. It's a lattice of migration, exchange, reinvention, but there are patterns. Similar ceramics, similar housing styles, even shared agricultural practices. It's a breadcrumb trail, scattered across centuries and states, so maybe Mill Creek didn't disappear. Maybe they moved, blended, merged with other groups, changed languages, adopted new identities, and carried their memories into unfamiliar places. Maybe they left their villages and never looked back, not because they failed, but because they adapted. Of course, that's not the whole story. Cultural continuity is a lovely idea, especially when it spares us from having to confront collapse, but the archaeology doesn't always cooperate. Some Mill Creek sites show signs of stress, reduced population density, shrinking village sizes, possible nutritional deficits. There's evidence of defensive behavior, as seen at Kimball Village, and of shifts in material culture, new pottery types, fewer large communal features, more isolation, all of which suggests not just transformation, but fragmentation. And here's the deeper discomfort. We want prehistoric stories to have a legacy, a visible endpoint, but sometimes they just stop. Not because people were wiped out, but because the culture changed so completely that its old name no longer made sense. The Mill Creek tradition may have flowed into other streams of indigenous history, or it may have dried up at the margins, remembered only in pottery shards and trench lines. Either way, the people didn't vanish. Their descendants are still here, just under different names, living new stories, shaped by old ones we only half understand. But if the fate of Mill Creek is a mystery of movement and identity, the next site offers something more concrete and far more brutal, a village with a dark economy, where bison bones were stacked like currency, and survival meant mastering the chaos of the plains. 11. Bison specialization at Dixon. In the late 1300s, the people who lived near what's now Dixon, Iowa, were doing something remarkable and a little unnerving. They had turned the bison into a business model, or maybe a lifestyle, or maybe a cosmology. Whatever it wasn't casual. It was obsessive. This was a full-blown pre-contact meat economy built around one very large and very unpredictable animal. The Dixon site is one of the clearest examples of bison specialization in prehistoric Iowa. Believed to be a large Oneota village, Dixon didn't just hunt bison, they organized around them. The evidence is in the bones, thousands of them, scattered, sorted, sometimes butchered with terrifying efficiency, long bones cracked for marrow, skull fragments piled, joints separated with surgical precision. These weren't occasional kills. These were industrial slaughters. And here's the mystery. Bison didn't always live in Iowa in massive numbers. Their presence fluctuated with climate, grassland availability, and human movement. So how did the Oneota of Dixon manage to rely so heavily on them? Were they traveling to hunt, or were the bison coming to them? Seasonal herds, a sweet spot in the landscape, a bit of both? Modern reconstructions suggest that Dixon sat on a transitional zone between prairie and woodland, a kind of ecological hinge where different resources overlapped. In other words, the perfect trap. Cornfields on one side, grazing lands on the other, and a river nearby to move goods or bodies as needed. The people of Dixon were not just hunters, they were farmers, traders, tool makers. But it's the scale of the bison use that keeps pulling archaeologists back in. This wasn't just subsistence, this was production. And once you start producing at scale, you start asking other questions. Who's managing the hunt? Who's storing the meat? Who's distributing it? Who's deciding who eats what? And then, what happens when the bison don't show up? We don't know how long the Dixon site was occupied, but like most large Oneota villages, it didn't last forever. Maybe the bison migrated elsewhere. Maybe the climate shifted. Maybe the balance between farming and hunting tilted too far in one direction. Whatever the reason, the site was eventually abandoned. The bones stayed. The people didn't. But what they left behind is chillingly efficient. A map of how to turn the landscape into calories. A manual for controlling risk until the risk controls you. And if Dixon was a model of bison mastery, the next site shows the other side of that relationship. A kill site so raw, so concentrated that it reads less like a village and more like a moment. A freeze frame of a hunt. A place where Paleo-Indian precision met Ice Age muscle in one ancient, chaotic encounter. 12. Cherokee Sewer bison kill. It doesn't sound glamorous, Cherokee Sewer, but deep under that humble name is one of Iowa's most dramatic archaeological windows into the Ice Age. Beneath layers of modern development in Cherokee County lies a Paleo-Indian bison kill site, a site that feels less like a hunting camp and more like a prehistoric crime scene. What researchers uncovered here wasn't a village, a cemetery, or a ceremonial mound. It was bones. Dozens of bison remains clustered in a single location, broken, butchered, rearranged. All the evidence points to a sudden, deliberate event, a hunt. But how? That's the first mystery. Were the animals driven into a trap? Maybe a snowdrift, a muddy bank, or a narrow ravine where movement was limited? Or were they ambushed? Some believe this was a planned mass kill, carefully orchestrated by skilled hunters with intimate knowledge of the animal behavior and the terrain. Others suggest it may have been opportunistic, an Ice Age version of right place, right time, sharp spear. What we do know is that the bones were processed carefully, methodically. These weren't just hunters, they were technicians. Tools made from chipped stone littered the site, long bones split, marrow extracted, tongue bones removed, skulls broken open. Not a wasteful kill, a strategic one, dating places the event roughly around 10,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last Ice Age, a time when humans and megafauna were still trying to figure out their uneasy relationship. The bison at Cherokee weren't quite the modern version. They were larger, woollier, Ice Age-ier, and while they weren't mammoths, they played a similar ecological role, big, mobile, and absolutely crucial to survival. But here's the paradox. This wasn't a permanent camp. There's no long-term habitation layer, no houses, no deep trash pits. It was a moment, an intense, possibly seasonal activity that left behind more questions than answers. Why there? Why then? Was this a regular hunting ground passed between generations, or a one-off miracle of timing? And what about the hunters themselves? We don't have names, we don't have art, we don't even have their bones, but we have their choices.
the way they butchered, the way they processed, the way they extracted every usable part of the animal. It speaks to more than hunger. It speaks to knowledge, system, culture, and then it ends. Like all things end, the kill site is eventually buried under silt, then topsoil, then concrete and storm drains. A few stone tools remain, a few reports filed, and that's it until someone digs it up and realizes that once, 10 millennia ago, the ground trembled with hooves and people waited with spears in hand and no backup plan. But if Cherokee Sewer shows us what a single hunt looked like, the next mystery zooms out. Instead of a kill site, we get a puzzle made from pottery, tools, and food debris scattered across acres, evidence of a vast and
strangely organized community that science still can't quite explain. 13. Weaver, bypass, mega assemblage. It started as these things often do with a highway project. In the early 2000s, road crews working near Weaver, Iowa, unearthed something far older than asphalt. Beneath the soil lay the largest Oneota artifact assemblage ever found in the state, a staggering quantity of pottery shards, stone tools, food remains, and architectural debris that archaeologists quickly dubbed the Weaver Bypass Mega Assemblage. Less catchy than Lost City of Gold, perhaps, but significantly more real and much harder to explain. What made this site special wasn't just its size, though that certainly turned heads. It was the density, the organization, the intentionality. Thousands upon thousands of artifacts layered across what appeared to be a sprawling village site, complete with evidence of dwellings, storage pits, refuse areas, and industrial-scale food processing zones. In short, Weaver wasn't a campsite, it was a system. The pottery told one story, distinct Oneota ceramics, many finely made, some showing decorative motifs that may have held cultural or ritual significance. The bones told another, evidence of both hunting and agriculture, of bison, deer, fish, corn, squash, and nuts. And then there were the tools, chisels, scrapers, and what might have been specialized implements for textile or hide production. All of it pointed to a community that wasn't just surviving, but thriving, or more accurately, producing. Weaver appears to have been a center of surplus, food surplus, craft surplus, possibly even social surplus. And that's where the mystery thickens, because once you have surplus, you have to ask, surplus for whom? Was Weaver an elite hub where high-status individuals coordinated labor and redistributed goods? Was it a trade center connecting river routes to inland settlements? Or was it something more communal, a seasonal gathering place where multiple groups came together to work, feast, and negotiate? Some archaeologists propose that Weaver represents a kind of prehistoric proto-city, not urban in the modern sense, but organized at a scale rarely seen in this region. Others caution against reading too much into density, pointing out that high artifact concentrations can be the result of long-term, intermittent occupation rather than coordinated large-scale planning. But the real question is one of structure, not just architectural, but social. Was there hierarchy here? Were certain families or lineages in charge of production? Was labor divided by age, gender, clan, skill? We don't know, and the artifacts won't tell us. And yet the sheer complexity of the Weaver site suggests something deeper. It wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a place where decisions were made, where relationships were managed, where a community defined itself not by what it built, but by what it left behind. And what it left is impressive, overwhelming, and maddeningly incomplete. But if Weaver was a
center of accumulation, the next mystery takes us to a different kind of center, one that spanned state borders, blurred cultural lines, and left behind mounds, rings, and rumors of something even stranger still, a place where Oneota life reached both its height and its most confusing.
14. Blood Run's true size and features. Blood Run isn't just a name, it's a boundary, a murky, ancient, and oddly poetic one shared between Iowa and South Dakota, straddling the Big Sioux River like a ghost too large to fit in a single state. It's the site of one of the most significant late prehistoric cultural centers in the Midwest, a hub of Oneota life, a place of trade, ceremony, burial, and riddles. Modern maps call it the Blood Run National Historic Landmark, but long before that, it was a thriving village, possibly the heart of a regional polity that stretched across the northern plains. Archaeologists have counted dozens of mounds here, burial mounds, platform mounds, linear ridges. There are stone circles, midden heaps, shells from distant rivers, pipestone artifacts, copper fragments, layers of activity stacked like old secrets. And yet, for all this evidence, we still don't know exactly what Blood Run was. Some believe it was a ceremonial center, a gathering point for the Oneota, and possibly other nearby cultures. Others argue for a permanent settlement, complete with a stratified society and trade networks that stretch to Cahokia and beyond. A few even float the idea that Blood Run functioned as a kind of capital, political, spiritual, economic. But the puzzle isn't just what Blood Run was, it's what people say it was. Old reports, some reliable, some less so, claim strange features not yet fully verified. A serpentine mound stretching along the bluff line, linear arrangements of stones that don't quite follow natural paths, stories passed down about alignments with solstices or star patterns, even hints of pre-European mapping systems etched into the landscape. Not all of this can be confirmed, but not all of it can be dismissed either. What's clearer is that Blood Run wasn't isolated. Similar artifacts, building styles, and ceremonial features have been found throughout the upper Midwest, which raises the question, was Blood Run part of a larger network, a spiritual geography, a movement? Its location suggests importance near water, near trails, near natural resources. Its layout suggests complexity and the sheer volume of materials recovered. Pottery, tools, exotic goods implies both wealth and intention. And then, like so many others, it was abandoned. There are theories: climate change, social upheaval, migration, disease, but again, no single smoking arrowhead, just the slow erosion of clarity. Today, Blood Run sits mostly undeveloped, protected, but still vulnerable, still understudied, still only partly mapped. Tourists pass through, locals nod respectfully, researchers return with better tools and more questions, and beneath it all, the land remembers, quietly, reluctantly. But if Blood Run was a center of mystery, then the next story zooms out to the periphery, a curious pattern of Oneota settlements strung along a river like beads on a fraying thread. Not one village, but many. Not
one explanation, but, well, we'll get to that. 15. Why the Upper Iowa Oneota cluster? Along the winding ribbon of the Upper Iowa River, hidden beneath farmland, forests, and the occasional unbothered cow pasture, lies a chain of sites that has quietly kept archaeologists squinting into the void for decades. It's not one village, it's not one mound, it's a cluster, a seemingly coordinated group of Oneota settlements that spans several miles and multiple centuries. They appear on a map like an intentional constellation, strategically spaced, spatially aware, and remarkably consistent in material culture. These weren't random campsites, they were homes, communities, and the question is, communities of what? The Oneota culture itself is slippery by design, archaeologically visible, but interpretively evasive, spanning much of the upper Midwest from roughly 1000 to 1700 CE. Oneota groups shared common features: shell-tempered pottery with curvilinear motifs, longhouse-style dwellings, mixed economies of farming, hunting, and gathering, and a toolkit that blended practicality with aesthetic flair. But the upper Iowa River Valley complicates that picture. Along this quiet stretch of bluffs and bottomlands are at least half a dozen confirmed sites, some with signs of long-term occupation, others appearing more seasonal. Ceramics match generally, subsistence patterns line up, but beyond that, things start to unravel. Were these all part of one political entity, a single extended kin group, a series of allied but distinct villages tied together by trade, marriage, or ritual? Or were they competitors, strategically spaced to carve up resources while keeping an eye on one another? Some researchers point to the landscape itself for answers. The upper Iowa River cuts through northeastern Iowa's driftless area, a topographic anomaly that escaped glaciation and now boasts steep bluffs, deep valleys, and cold water springs. This ecological variety made it a perfect corridor for farming, fishing, and foraging. If you were going to establish a chain of settlements with strong seasonal mobility, this was the place. But others aren't so sure. The proximity of the sites might imply a coordinated system, but the variation in architecture and artifact density suggests subtle differences, possibly temporal, possibly cultural. Some sites show heavy farming, others emphasize hunting. Some have signs of ceremonial activity, others look like logistical hubs, more storage than settlement. It's like looking at the bones of a body without knowing whether it once danced or fought. And then there's the matter of timing. Were these sites all occupied simultaneously, or were they sequential, one village fading as another rose upriver? The answer depends on radiocarbon dates, pottery typologies, and the ever flimsy thread of stratigraphy, all of which are helpful until they aren't. There's also the social dimension. If these were linked communities, what held them together? Shared ancestors, shared enemies, shared stories told beside the fire, with river water lapping in the background and corn roasting over coals? We may never know, but the sheer density of sites in this narrow river valley suggests more than coincidence. It hints at strategy, intent, maybe even memory, a cultural magnetism that kept pulling people back to the same bluffs generation after generation. And if the Oneota were drawn to these landscapes for their resources, their river access, their view, then the next mystery speaks to an even deeper kind of attraction, not just where to live, but how to cultivate the land itself. Because buried just under the surface, under the roots and rocks, lies a remnant of prehistoric agriculture that refuses to behave. 16. Ridged field agriculture at Litka. Most Iowa farmland today is a flattened ocean of corn and soybeans, neatly squared, GPS aligned, and painfully optimized. But at the Litka site, near the upper Mississippi River, the ground tells a different story. Not flat, but ridged, not modern, but ancient. A quiet pattern of earthwork agriculture that whispers of forgotten innovation. These are the Litka ridged fields, one of the only confirmed examples of prehistoric raised field agriculture in Iowa. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, a grid of low earthen ridges separated by shallow troughs, deliberately shaped for growing crops. The mystery? Who built them? Why they used this system? And how widespread the practice really was. You'd think this would be a goldmine of insight. After all, prehistoric agriculture is one of the few things archaeologists can usually wrap their trowels around. But the ridged fields at Litka behave badly. They're hard to date. They don't come with diagnostic artifacts, and they occupy a weird ecological niche. Too hilly for traditional fields, but not quite marshland either. Some scholars compare them to similar fields used in Mesoamerica or the Southeast, places where water management and soil preservation were key to productivity. Others argue they were used to extend the growing season, warming the soil and improving drainage in marginal terrain. Still others suggest ritual function, rows aligned with cosmological principles, a garden geometry meant to please more than just the stomach. Whatever their purpose, they didn't make themselves. This was labor-intensive farming. Someone hauled dirt. Someone spaced these ridges just right. Someone managed planting, weeding, harvesting, maybe even seed selection, and then someone left. The ridges remained, preserved by luck and disuse. You won't see them driving by. You have to look. From the ground, they feel like irregularities, slight undulations in a field of grass. From above, though, they take on order. They almost hum. This hum, however, is where the frustration begins. Because if Litka represents just one site among many, then we're missing the others. Bad preservation, erosion, modern agriculture plowing over subtle histories, probably all of the above, which means Litka might not be special. It might be the last survivor of a once widespread practice. So now researchers are asking, were these fields part of a broader agricultural system? Did they serve one village or many? Were they experimental, seasonal, high status, commonplace? No one knows. And that's the discomfort. Not just that we can't explain them, but that we almost didn't notice them at all. Ridged fields are evidence not just of survival, but of strategy, of minds thinking long term, of societies manipulating landscape in quiet, intelligent ways. And if people were innovating in the dirt millennia ago, then it begs a larger, almost uncomfortable question. How long have
People really been here? Because up next is a mystery so ancient, so foundational, it casts doubt on every map, every date, and every assumption we've ever made about the human timeline in Iowa. 17. How early were humans here? Here's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. When did people actually arrive in Iowa? Not what culture or what technology or even why, but the more unnerving version. How far back does the human story really go here? And what evidence are we still missing beneath our boots? The official party line, at least the one you'll find in most textbooks and Heritage Center placards, goes like this. People arrived in Iowa around 13,000 years ago, right at the tail end of the Ice Age, when retreating glaciers opened up the landscape and the first Paleo-Indian groups moved in to chase big game across a cold, windswept prairie. Their calling cards? Fluted Clovis points, elegant, leaf-shaped spear tips, chipped with surgical precision from fine chert. These tools are iconic, practically logo tier in archaeological circles. They show up in scattered locations across Iowa, from creek bed to hilltops, each one a silent, gleaming vote for the late arrival theory. But here's the problem. That theory is starting to wobble because while Clovis points are real and datable and definitely post-glacial, they may not be the first signs of humans here, just the first ones we're good at recognizing. Over the past few decades, a growing number of sites in North America have hinted, sometimes loudly, sometimes with a whisper, at pre-Clovis occupation. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, or the Galt site in Texas suggest that humans were present before the traditional 13,000-year mark, which naturally leads to an unsettling follow-up. If pre-Clovis people made it that far south, what are the odds Iowa was skipped entirely? Enter the speculative zone. Some geologists and archaeologists working in Iowa have flagged unusual lithic scatters, stone tools or flakes embedded in deeply buried soils, below glacial tills or loess layers that, in theory, shouldn't contain human artifacts. In some cases, they're hundreds or thousands of years older than the accepted arrival window, but without direct dating, or a bone to go with the stone, or some miracle of preservation that survives both time and skeptical peer review. These finds sit in limbo. And that's where Iowa's early human timeline sits too, in limbo. We know Ice Age megafauna lived here. Mastadons, mammoths, giant sloths, bison larger than any today. We know humans hunted those animals elsewhere. And we have tools in Iowa that look an awful lot like those early traditions, but we don't have the smoking hearth, the carved bone, the buried campsite that says, yes, people lived here 15,000 years ago, and they left us this unequivocal proof. Yet, so archaeologists keep digging, keep hypothesizing, keep quietly rethinking the Clovis first model that dominated for generations, because the longer you stare into Iowa's deep past, the more you realize the ice didn't just retreat, it erased. Whatever was here before got
scraped, crushed, or buried under 300 feet of frozen indifference, and yet pieces remain, enough to question, enough to make you look at a fluted spear point and think, or maybe even earlier. But if the arrival date is already in question, what about their behaviors once they got here? That brings us to a chillingly specific event, a mammoth carcass, a Clovis point, and a muddy spring where someone 13,000 years ago decided to butcher a creature that outweighed a pickup truck.
18. Clovis Mammoth Butchery at Rummel's Maska. Spring. In the quiet rolling farmland of eastern Iowa, near a spring that still bubbles today, lies the scene of an Ice Age encounter, so vivid it feels intrusive to reconstruct. The site is called Rummel's Mask Spring. The headline, a mammoth butchered. The supporting detail, a Clovis point embedded in the debris. This is one of the few direct pieces of evidence we have for Clovis-era megafauna hunting in Iowa, and it's messy in the archaeological sense. The remains of the mammoth were not whole. Bones were scattered, broken, modified. Some had telltale cut marks from stone tools. Others were smashed to access marrow. A few showed evidence of being burned. And then there's the artifact, a beautifully crafted Clovis projectile point, unmistakably human, unmistakably lethal, found in direct association with the remains. It's the kind of find that moves a site from interesting to nationally significant in the eyes of archaeologists, because it suggests not just that humans and mammoths shared the landscape, but that they interacted dramatically. But here's where things get weird. It's still unclear whether this was a hunt or a harvest. Was the mammoth killed by humans at the spring, or did it die naturally, stuck in the mud perhaps, and become an opportunistic meat source for Ice Age foragers? This isn't a minor distinction. It cuts to the core of how Clovis people survived. Were they master hunters of megafauna, driving mammoths into ambushes with coordinated strategies and group cooperation? Or were they adaptable scavengers, taking advantage of natural deaths and environmental accidents? At Rummel's Maska, we don't quite have enough to say. What we do have is a vivid archaeological snapshot, a spring-fed pond, a dead mammoth, and humans who showed up with tools sharp enough to dismantle a creature that could crush a tree. The implications are enormous. It tells us they had knowledge of animal anatomy, tool production, food processing. It tells us they had courage, and it tells us they had patience. But the site also raises a quieter question. How often did this happen? If we only find one Clovis mammoth butchery site in Iowa, does that mean it was rare? Or does it mean we're just bad at finding them? After all, these events happened over 10,000 years ago. Most of the bones are gone. Most of the sites destroyed or buried beneath cities, rivers, and fields. Still, Rummel's Maska survives, just enough to tease us, just enough to confirm that Clovis people weren't just passing through Iowa. They were working, adapting, surviving, possibly thriving, and right down the ancient corridor from where they harvested this mammoth, another Ice Age colossus loomed. Not a predator, but a gentle giant, slower, stranger, and possibly just as hunted. Up next, ground sloths. Yes, plural, because Iowa, apparently, was their final congregation point, and no one knows why. 19. The Tarko Valley ground sloths. It's hard to picture a giant ground sloth, mostly because it looks like something nature came up with at 3 a.m. after 3 cups of coffee and no sleep. Imagine an animal the size of a car, shaped like a shaggy bear that forgot how to bear, with absurdly long claws and a face that seems permanently surprised. Then imagine a whole group of them lumbering through southwest Iowa's Tarko Valley toward their final destination. For reasons we still don't understand, welcome to one of the strangest Ice Age mysteries in the state, the curious case of the Tarko Valley ground sloths. Most people don't associate prehistoric Iowa with exotic megafauna. Mammoths, maybe. Mastodons, sure. But sloths, that sounds like something better suited to the tropics, or at least somewhere with more palm trees and fewer blizzards. And yet multiple remains of Megalonyx jeffersonii, the so-called Jefferson's ground sloth, have been found clustered in this narrow Iowa valley, not scattered across the Midwest, not lightly peppered through time. Clustered, concentrated, focused. That's where things get eerie. The site, discovered in the early 2000s near Shenandoah, has yielded at least 3 distinct individuals, possibly more, dating to around 12,000 years ago. These weren't just random bones either. These were well-preserved skeletal elements, limb bones, claws, vertebrae, enough to reconstruct not just what they looked like, but how they may have moved, fed, and possibly even died. And that's where the mystery begins. Why were so many ground sloths congregating in one specific valley in Iowa at the end of the Ice Age? Was it a migration corridor? A breeding ground? A sheltered refuge during a time of climate instability? Did they fall victim to a natural trap, like soft sediment near a spring? Or, more provocatively, were they hunted and processed here by humans? No one has found a Clovis point embedded in a sloth rib at Tarko, but the timing is suspiciously close. And the proximity of human presence and megafauna extinction is, as always, a narrative that archaeologists approach with equal parts interest and unease. What makes this even more puzzling is how little we understand about Megalonyx behavior. Unlike mammoths or bison, which roamed in vast herds and left behind plentiful remains, sloths were solitary, slow, ecologically peculiar. They were browsers, not grazers, nibbling on twigs, leaves, bark. They moved awkwardly, though powerfully, and likely had few predators due to their sheer size. So why were multiple individuals in this single Iowa valley? Some researchers suggest the answer lies in the valley's unique ecology. The Tarko River would have provided year-round water. The surrounding Loess Hills could have offered shelter, and the post-glacial climate was in flux, warming, drying, changing. Maybe these sloths were pushed into a shrinking pocket of suitable habitat. Maybe they gathered here the way animals sometimes do before vanishing, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. There's also the haunting possibility that this was a generational collapse site, a place where a family group, or the last survivors of a fading population, found themselves hemmed in by environmental change and perhaps by the slow encroachment of a very clever new predator, us. But we don't know. There are no definitive kill marks, no nearby habitation layers, just the bones of giant vegetarians who had no business being in Iowa, except clearly they were. And the implications are bigger than sloths. If Tarko was a last stand or a migration path or a resource node, it suggests that the Ice Age ecosystems of Iowa were far more complex and dynamic than we give them credit for. Not just woolly, cold, and empty, but alive, interconnected, fragile. And speaking of fragile, there's another massive mammal that once lumbered through these parts, more iconic than a sloth, and somehow even less understood. Its tusks curled, its shoulders hunched, and its bones now lie buried across the state, inviting every new generation of researchers to ask the same question: what happened to Iowa's mastodons?
20. Ice Age mastodons in Iowa. Before there were tractors plowing the cornfields, before roads divided the prairie, and long before anyone thought to call this place Iowa, mastodons roamed the land, and they weren't just passing through.
from scattered farm fields to gravel quarries. Bits and pieces of Mammoth americanum, the American mastodon, have emerged from the soil like forgotten puzzle pieces. Jawbones, ribs, enormous molars the size of bricks, and tusks, always the tusks, curling like frozen question marks out of the Pleistocene, while mammoths get all the Ice Age fame. Thanks in part to their shaggy movie star reputation, mastodons were the quieter cousins, forest dwellers rather than grassland roamers, browsers rather than grazers. They were built like muscular, hairy tanks, standing up to 10 feet at the shoulder and weighing as much as 5 tons. And they were here in Iowa for a long time. But then they weren't. The fossil record shows mastodons across Iowa well into the late Pleistocene, some even surviving until around 11,000 years ago. That's tantalizingly close to the arrival of the Clovis culture, close enough that you can start to feel the edges of a collision between species, between timelines, between worlds. At the Tarko Valley site, mastodon bones have been found alongside the ground sloths, suggesting perhaps that this region served as a crossroads for large Ice Age fauna. Other major finds, like the Manchester mastodon in Delaware County, have yielded nearly complete skeletons, with bones so well preserved they seem to defy time. But again, the mystery isn't just the bones, it's the context. Most of these remains show no definitive signs of human interaction, no butchery marks, no tools, just big animals who lived here, then died here, and now lie silent beneath soybean fields and drainage ditches. So what caused the extinction? Climate change is the safe answer. As the Ice Age ended, forests shifted, wetlands dried, and the mastodons' preferred habitat vanished. Their population likely shrank, and with low reproduction rates, even a small disruption could have spelled disaster. But there's also the human factor. We know people were here. We know they were hunting, and even if they didn't regularly kill mastodons, the pressure they put on ecosystems, burning landscapes, altering migration paths, hunting other prey, may have been enough to tip the balance. The truth is probably a little of both. A changing world, nudged over the edge by a new and unpredictable species, armed with spears and an unquenchable curiosity. Mastodons, like sloths and mammoths, disappeared. But their bones remain, stubborn and ancient, forcing us to rethink what Iowa once was, a place not of silent prairies, but of thundering giants. And yet, even now, life from that frozen age lingers in unexpected corners, tiny, overlooked, miraculously alive. Up next, a species that refused to die, hiding in Iowa's coldest crevices, a fossilized heartbeat still pulsing beneath the leaves. 21. Pleistocene snails in algific slopes. Let's say you're hiking through northeastern Iowa, maybe just killing time, dodging bugs, wondering how you ended up on a trail that Google Maps swore was easy. And then unexpectedly, you notice the air shift, a sudden chill, like stepping into a refrigerator someone left open in the woods. The moss gets thicker. The plants look wrong, not dead, just out of place, like they haven't realized they're in Iowa. And then, if you're lucky or obsessive, you might see one of them, a snail, smaller than a fingernail, clinging to a limestone ledge like it's guarding a secret from 15,000 years ago. This is an algific talus slope, and it's not just rare, it's prehistoric air conditioning. These shaded north-facing slopes are connected to underground ice caves, fissures, and vents that leak cold air all summer, preserving a microclimate more at home in the Pleistocene than the present. And within this fragile, ancient breath of coldness live the survivors, tiny, cold-loving snail species that by all logic should have gone extinct when the glaciers melted. They didn't. Instead, they retreated, slowly, obviously, into these pockets of perpetual chill. They've been clinging to existence ever since, curled into the cracks and crannies of Iowa's driftless area like living punctuation marks at the end of the Ice Age. Among them is Discus maclintocki, also known as the Iowa Pleistocene snail, which sounds like a bad folk band, but is actually a federally protected species. It's also a kind of evolutionary time capsule, unchanged in any meaningful way for thousands of years, which is impressive and terrifying because these snails are so dependent on their bizarre microhabitat that any disruption, logging, erosion, a slight shift in ground temperature could wipe them out for good. That raises the bigger question: how have they survived this long? Algific slopes are notoriously hard to find. They require just the right mix of topography, geology, and hydrology. Most were created by the last glaciation, which sculpted the land like a half-blind sculptor with too much caffeine and a chisel made of ice. But northeastern Iowa uniquely escaped glaciation in the most recent ice advance. The result is a pocket of rugged hills, deep valleys, and fractured bedrock, the perfect place for cold air to get trapped and forgotten. The snails, they followed the cold, or rather, they refused to leave it. Researchers first identified these ancient species in the 20th century, long after their better-known megafaunal neighbors had been excavated, mounted, and put in museums. But unlike mammoths and mastadons, these tiny mollusks didn't leave bones or drama behind, just an evolutionary whisper. It's tempting to think of these snails as evolutionary dead ends, frozen relics waiting to expire, but that's not quite fair. They've endured more than most species ever will: rapid climate shifts, habitat fragmentation, industrialization, and the general indifference of modern humans. And they've done it quietly, with no tools, no weapons, no grand adaptations, just persistence. That's why algific slopes are now protected by state agencies, by the National Park Service, by anyone paying attention. Because they don't just house snails, they hold an entire lost ecosystem: rare ferns, relict mosses, ghostly insects that shouldn't be here anymore. They're fragments of Iowa's ice age, still functioning, still breathing, barely. And while the snails may not inspire blockbuster movies or children's books, they ask the same questions the mammoths did. What does it take to survive a changing world? And how long can you cling to the past before the future erases you anyway? Which brings us to a stranger relic still, something not alive, not even close, but buried deep beneath Decorah, Iowa. It holds clues to a planetary event so ancient, so violent, it didn't just shape Iowa. It may have helped shape the Earth itself. 22. Decorah impact structure. You wouldn't notice it from the street. Drive through Decorah, Iowa, and you'll see quaint shops, steep bluffs, a river winding through the heart of town. You won't see the crater because it's buried, deep, silent, and 470 million years old. Welcome to the Decorah impact structure, a nearly 4-mile wide underground crater created by a meteorite slamming into ancient seafloor during the Ordovician period. That's before dinosaurs, before trees, before Iowa was anything resembling land. Back then it was a warm, shallow sea filled with trilobites and other hard-shelled absurdities. And into this peaceful marine paradise came a rock from space, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Rock vaporized, water boiled, a crater formed instantaneously. Then the sea rushed back in, filling the hole with sediment and preserving what might be one of the strangest fossil beds in the world. It stayed hidden until the 1990s, when a series of deep drilling projects, mostly looking for groundwater, hit something unexpected: a ring of shocked bedrock, slumped strata, and a layer of shale that didn't match anything in the surrounding geology. Geologists started connecting the dots,
And what they found wasn't just a crater, it was a time capsule, a buried wound in the Earth's crust, preserved like a scar under a bandage. The Decorah impact is now believed to be part of something much bigger, a potential meteor swarm that bombarded the planet roughly 470 million years ago. Evidence from other sites around the world, especially in Sweden, suggests that a massive asteroid broke apart in space and Earth, lucky us, got pelted by the debris. The Decorah crater is one of the best preserved examples of this event. Not only does it show classic impact features, shocked quartz, disturbed layers, breccia, but it also contains the Winnik shale, a geologic layer that trapped an exceptional array of Ordovician fossils. More on that shortly. But the impact itself remains poorly understood. We know the size of the crater, we know the age, but we don't know how wide the destruction reached, how hot it got, whether it triggered regional extinction or ecological disruption, and perhaps more unnervingly, we don't know how many more craters like it are buried beneath Iowa's feet. Because if a 4-mile wide meteor can land, explode, erase, and hide for 470 million years, only to be discovered by accident, what else is waiting under the cornfields? The Decorah crater doesn't just remind us of Earth's vulnerability, it reminds us how little we actually see, that beneath every gentle hill and shallow stream, there may be a story too old for memory, too deep for shovels, and too important to ignore. And if the crater is the wound, the fossils it preserved are the aftershocks, living records of a world that once was, trapped in shale and shadow, whispering something utterly alien from the deep sea of ancient Iowa.
23. The Winnik loggerstata surprise. At the bottom of what was once a meteor-blasted sea, where ancient mud settled into silence after the sky fell, something remarkable happened. Life, soft-bodied, squishy, and normally invisible in the fossil record, got trapped, perfectly, intact, like bugs in amber, but older, wetter, and way weirder. This is the Winnik loggerstata, one of the most extraordinary fossil sites, not just in Iowa, but in the entire world. It's a buried ecosystem from the Ordovician period, sealed in a rare, fine-grained shale at the heart of the Decorah impact structure, and it contains fossils that simply shouldn't exist, not because they're implausible, because they're improbable. The term Lagerstätte, German for storage place, is used by paleontologists to describe fossil deposits of exceptional preservation. These sites are rare, they're lottery wins, and the Winnik shale is one of them, preserving animals that normally rot away before they can fossilize. Jellyfish-like creatures, worms, soft-bodied arthropods, things without bones, things that look like nightmares drawn by a sleep-deprived marine biologist. One of the most shocking finds here is Pentacopterus decorahensis, an ancient sea scorpion, or Eurypterid, named after the Greek warship Pentaconter due to its vaguely boat-like shape. It was more than 5 feet long, armored, and probably not very friendly, and it is, as of now, the oldest known Eurypterid in the world. Let that sink in. A predator that lived 467 million years ago in Iowa, before Iowa was Iowa, before fish had jaws, before plants had leaves. This creature lived in the immediate aftermath of a meteor impact. Whether the crater created the conditions for preservation or destroyed an existing ecosystem that was then immortalized in the shale is still being debated. Either way, the result is a paleontological jackpot, but Pentacopterus is just the tip of the spear. Winnik fossils include dozens of other weird and poorly understood animals. Some resemble known groups, others are still being named. Some defy classification entirely. The diversity here suggests a stable, thriving ecosystem that was either temporarily knocked off balance by the impact or perhaps just preserved by pure cosmological coincidence. And because this shale lies deep underground, the only way to access it is through carefully drilled cores. That means the full extent of the loggerstata is unknown. We've seen a sliver, maybe a few square feet, a single geological whisper, and it's already turned everything we thought we knew about early Ordovician life sideways. There's also a delicious irony here. The same meteorite that may have devastated an ecosystem might also be the reason we know that ecosystem existed at all. The crater created a low oxygen basin, which in turn slowed decay, creating perfect conditions for fossilization. So in a way, Pentacopterus owes its immortality to a cosmic accident, a blast from above that took everything and left a few monsters behind for us to find. But it's not just the life that's fascinating, it's the implications. This isn't just a weird fossil site, it's a recalibration, a reminder that deep time doesn't move in straight lines, that life, even when it's soft and vulnerable, can find its way into stone. And if this ancient crater holds life from 500 million years ago, just imagine what might lie beneath the other impact site in Iowa, the one even larger, even older, and somehow even more mysterious. 24. Manson impact. How big were the effects? You've probably driven near it without realizing, or flown over it, staring out the airplane window, utterly unaware. The Manson impact structure isn't marked by a ring of shattered stone or a convenient crater museum. It's subtle, buried beneath layers of glacial drift, farmland, and geological amnesia. But it's there, a 24-mile-wide scar from a cosmic sucker punch that hit Iowa roughly 74 million years ago. This wasn't some little meteorite. This was a city killer, an ocean boiler, a planetary event. The Manson impact structure, centered near the town of Manson in north-central Iowa, was created when a space rock, estimated to be more than a mile wide, slammed into the earth during the late Cretaceous period. Back then, this part of Iowa was near the edge of the Western Interior Seaway, a vast inland ocean that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. The impact hit waterlogged marine sediments. The result? A steam explosion so violent it likely vaporized everything in the area for miles in every direction. Shocked quartz, deformed bedrock, a ring of fractured crust. The evidence is all there if you know where to look. And for a while, scientists thought they were looking at the big one, the impact that caused the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. It was that big, that old, that dramatic. But later research corrected the record. The extinction event came 10 million years later, and from a much larger impact near what's now Chicxulub, Mexico. So Manson didn't kill the dinosaurs, but that doesn't mean it was gentle. The hydrothermal system created by the impact probably lasted for thousands of years, circulating hot water, reshaping minerals, altering local geochemistry. The surrounding environment was transformed, possibly triggering local ecological shifts we still don't fully understand, and the crater itself became a geological curiosity, deeply buried, revealed only through oil drilling, seismic surveys, and the kind of persistence that only geologists have the patience for. What's strange is how little we know about what happened after the impact. We can model the blast, we can see the shattered rocks, but the long-term consequences remain hazy. Was there a regional extinction? Did it alter ocean circulation in the seaway? Could it have contributed to evolutionary shifts in marine life? These are still open questions. Even the exact shape and structure of the crater is debated. Unlike other impact sites, Manson doesn't reveal itself easily. There's no rim, no central uplift peeking through the landscape. It's a buried mystery, partly visible through rock cores, geophysical data, and grainy seismic images. And yet its legacy is massive. In every way that matters, the Manson impact structure is a reminder that Iowa's calm, rural surface hides the scars of planetary violence. Beneath the fields of soybeans and wind turbines lies proof that the sky once fell here and left a mark no one noticed for 70 million years. And as we leave the world of shattered craters behind, the next mystery brings us back to the surface, into the strange, rolling ridges of the land itself, ridges that march across the Iowa landscape with no clear purpose, no obvious origin, and yet they're everywhere, waiting. 25. Iowa's Paha Ridges. There are ridges across Iowa that don't belong there, long, narrow, sinuous things rising subtly above the prairie, like frozen waves or ancient buried dragons that never quite broke the surface. You've probably driven over one and never noticed. To the untrained eye, they look like gentle hills, a natural quirk of the landscape, but to geologists, they're a riddle, unexpected, unruly, and unmistakably deliberate. These are Iowa's Paha. The word Paha comes from the Dakota Sioux language, meaning hill or ridge, and that's exactly what they are, kind of, but it's the how and why that causes problems. These ridges, most common in east-central Iowa, stretch for miles in a northwest-southeast orientation, with shapes that seem oddly uniform but infuriatingly inconsistent. Some are knife-edged and steep, others are broader and lower, but all of them are made primarily of liis, fine, wind-blown silt, and capped by prairie soils that suggest they've been stable for thousands of years. So where did they come from? Early geologists thought they were glacial moraines, debris piles left by retreating ice sheets. That theory didn't hold up. The alignment was wrong, the materials were too uniform, and there weren't enough boulders or varied sediments mixed in. These weren't dump heaps from melting glaciers, they were something else. The next theory? Wind. As the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, huge amounts of fine silt were left exposed on the outwashed plains. Winds howled across the tundra-like landscape, picking up dust and redepositing it across the Midwest. Loess is found across the region, especially thick in western Iowa, but the Paha Ridges are different. They concentrate that loess into narrow, elevated bands, like someone combed the landscape and all the dirt clumped together, but that just raises more questions. Why did the loess accumulate in lines instead of spreading evenly? Why did it build up in some places but not others? And why do the ridges almost always point in the same direction, northwest to southeast, as if following some ancient forgotten wind pattern? Some researchers suggest that the underlying bedrock or topography created wind eddies, localized zones where sediment could settle and build up over time. Others propose that snowdrifts or shallow ice features acted as natural windbreaks, allowing loess to pile up in long, narrow corridors, and some theories go further, suggesting that vegetation, perhaps even sparse tundra grasses, helped anchor the ridges once they began to form, allowing them to persist and grow. But no single theory explains all the Paha. Some have loess more than 20 feet deep. Others barely rise above the surrounding terrain. Some show signs of soil development going back over 15,000 years. Others appear more recent, and even with modern tools, LiDAR, core sampling, stratigraphic mapping, we still don't know why these ridges exist where they do or why they formed the way they did. They are, in a word, inconvenient. Not for modern people. We can build roads and farms over them without much trouble, but for the narrative of neat geological timelines and cause-effect logic, they're an annoyance, an exception that refuses to be categorized, a shape that shouldn't persist in a landscape as heavily modified and eroded as Iowa's. Even their cultural legacy is odd. Early settlers sometimes built their homes or fences along the ridges, taking advantage of the elevation. Others ignored them. Few understood what they were. Today they're marked on topographic maps, studied in graduate theses, and occasionally mentioned in roadside signage that's been sun-faded into illegibility, but they persist, quietly, obscurely, a natural code waiting to be cracked. And just when you think you're getting closer to an answer, when the models almost make sense and the wind patterns start to line up, the land throws another curveball, an even larger mystery, not of form, but of process. Because just to the northeast of these ridges lies an even stranger surface, one so heavily debated that geologists still can't agree on how it formed or even when. Let's talk about the Iowan erosion surface, or as it's also known, the place where logic goes to erode.
26. The Iowan erosion surface debate. It sounds boring. Erosion surface, you might imagine a windswept hill or a field with poor drainage, something that shows up on a soil report and gets ignored at city council meetings. But in northeastern Iowa, erosion surface means something entirely different. It means a sweeping, undulating landscape that doesn't follow the rules, a geological feature so confusing, so controversial, and so stubborn that it's been the center of academic disputes for over a century. This is the Iowan erosion surface, spanning thousands of square miles, stretching from Minnesota to central Iowa, marked by rolling uplands, scattered boulders, and a landscape that looks deceptively gentle until you try to explain it. Here's what we know. The Iowan erosion surface, IES, is a broad, smoothed area of terrain that cuts through older glacial deposits. It lacks the sharp ridges and dramatic relief of recently glaciated land. Instead, it presents as a vast, wave-like plateau, eroded, yes, but not uniformly. It has strange humps and swales. It has isolated ridges, and most baffling of all, it contains large glacial erratics, boulders of Canadian rock that don't belong there. So how did it form? Early geologists proposed that it was carved by meltwater, massive flows from retreating glaciers that scoured the landscape like a cosmic power washer. Others argued for periglacial processes, freeze-thaw cycles, solifluction, and wind erosion during times when the area was cold but ice-free. Then came the Loess theory. Maybe wind-deposited silt was later eroded by slope wash and rainfall, leaving behind only the more resistant knobs and high points. The problem is, all of these theories explain some features, but not all of them. The IES seems too deeply carved to be purely wind-shaped, but the lack of clear glacial striations and moraines makes full ice coverage unlikely. The erratics suggest glacier action, but their random distribution doesn't align with known ice margins, and the overall surface doesn't match any single glacial episode. It's not just a product of the last ice age, but potentially multiple ones layered together, like a badly edited manuscript. In recent years, some geologists have suggested that the IES may not be one thing at all, but several unrelated processes that happen to overlap, a kind of geomorphic Frankenstein's monster. Others argue that it represents a long period of exposure between glaciations when slow, subtle erosion reshaped the land without any dramatic event, a story told in whispers instead of explosions. And this is what makes the IES so haunting. It's not just that we don't know what caused it, it's that the land is still here, still visible, still untouched by our explanations. It's the geological equivalent of déjà vu, a landscape that looks familiar but feels wrong, like something left behind by an earlier version of the planet. But the next mystery is even older and even more crystalline, because tucked into the ancient limestone and shale of southeastern Iowa are rock bubbles filled with glittering treasure, spheres of quartz and calcite that seem to grow from nothing. They're beautiful, they're bizarre, and no one can agree on exactly how they formed. 27. Keokuk geodes. How did the crystals grow? They don't look like much on the outside, just grayish lumps, roundish and pitted, scattered through the limestone beds of southeastern Iowa like discarded cannonballs from a geological battle
no one remembers, but crack one open carefully with the right tools and a little luck, and you'll find the unexpected, a glittering cathedral of crystals, purple amethyst, smoky quartz, celestite, calcite, goethite, pyrite, sometimes flawless, sometimes jagged, always exquisite. These are the Keokuk geodes, Earth's most glamorous secrets hidden inside the most unassuming packaging. Geodes are found around the world, but nowhere quite like Iowa. The area surrounding Keokuk, particularly near the Des Moines River and in Lee, Henry, and Van Buren counties, boasts one of the densest concentrations of these geological oddities on the planet. The local limestone formations, specifically the lower Mississippian age Warsaw Formation, roughly 340 million years old, are riddled with them, some small enough to fit in your palm, others nearly 2 feet across. And here's the mystery. How exactly did they form? The general idea is straightforward. Geodes begin as cavities in rock. Those cavities then slowly fill with minerals, crystallizing from groundwater over thousands or millions of years. That's the short version. But as always, the devil is in the geochemistry. Some geodes may have started as gas bubbles in ancient underwater sediments. Others may have formed from organic material, animal burrows, plant roots, or even decaying matter, leaving behind voids that slowly became mineralized. In the Keokuk region, the cavities are thought to have originated in soft limestone or mudstone, possibly through the dissolution of nodules or fossils. But even if we accept the cavity origin, the crystal growth inside is still a puzzle. Why are some geodes completely filled with concentric bands of chalcedony, while others are hollow with delicate needle-like quartz points? Why do some contain rare minerals like barite or strontianite, while others are simple agate-lined marbles? Why is there such variability in color, shape, and clarity all within the same rock unit? Geologists have proposed that fluid chemistry, especially the levels of silica, calcium, and other trace elements, played a major role. As mineral-rich water percolated through the rock, it deposited layers inside the geodes depending on temperature, pH, and pressure, but these conditions would have had to change over time and across tiny distances to account for the diversity we see. Some researchers argue for hydrothermal involvement, low-temperature fluids circulating through faults or fractures during a long-forgotten phase of tectonic activity. Others favor a more stable sedimentary diagenesis model where the minerals precipitated slowly as the host rock was buried and compressed. Both scenarios fit some of the evidence. Neither explains it all. And then there's the timing. How long does it take to grow a geode? No one knows. These are not clocked events. There's no datable organic matter inside. We estimate based on rock age, burial depth, and comparisons to similar formations elsewhere, but the true age of individual geodes and the speed of their growth remains frustratingly vague. But maybe that's part of the charm. Keokuk geodes are not fossils. They are not bones or tools or ancient messages written in stone. They are geological accidents. Chemical poems born in silence. They didn't evolve. They didn't adapt. They just happened beautifully, quietly, without anyone watching. And somehow they became iconic. Collectors travel from around the world to dig for them in old quarries and road cuts, wielding hammers and hope. Locals sell them at gift shops and flea markets where children crack them open with rented vices and gasp at the sparkle inside. Scientists try to explain them. Artists try to mimic them. And the land just keeps producing them, one geode at a time. But if these glittering anomalies are Iowa's quietest geological miracle, the next mystery reaches back into the deep past of human presence, where copper tools show up far from their source, hinting at an ancient trade network that linked Iowa to a place hundreds of miles away, a place with no connection to corn, mounds, or geodes, but plenty of ore.
28. Old copper in Iowa. Long before railroads or fur traders, long before maps or borders or anyone argued about where the Midwest begins, copper was moving quietly, deliberately, across rivers and ridge lines, through forests and floodplains, not by accident, not by natural erosion, but by people, ancient people, people who wanted copper not because it was rare, but because it was meaningful, and somehow it ended up in Iowa. Across the state, scattered in isolated archaeological contexts, researchers have found small worked pieces of native copper, pins, awls, beads, and fragments. Not much, not enough to suggest local production, but enough to raise eyebrows. Because the nearest known source of naturally pure copper, the kind that can be cold hammered into tools without smelting, is hundreds of miles away along the southern shores of Lake Superior. That's where the old copper complex flourished, particularly in present day Wisconsin and Michigan. From about 4000 to 1500 BCE, people there were mining copper straight from bedrock outcrops and glacial float, using hammerstones to break apart ore and shape it into utilitarian tools. They weren't smelting it. They didn't need to. The purity was that high. And they traded it down rivers, across portages, far from its origin. But what did it mean when that copper reached Iowa? Some archaeologists suggest it was purely functional, a superior material for piercing, scraping, or cutting, but others point to the context. Copper in Iowa often turns up in mortuary settings associated with burials from the Archaic period. In these cases, the copper isn't just a tool, it's a symbol, a prestige item, a gift to the dead, not the living. And then there's the mystery of how it got here. No copper mines exist in Iowa, no smelting furnaces, no large-scale production sites. So every bit of copper found here had to be carried, traded, handed off between cultures through vast networks that likely extended across half the continent. A piece of copper found in eastern Iowa may have passed through a dozen hands before being deposited in the earth. Was it traded directly? Did local groups travel to the Great Lakes to acquire it? Or did it move hand to hand, gift to gift, over years and generations? No one knows. We also don't know how consistently it was used. Unlike in Wisconsin, where entire toolkits were sometimes made of copper, Iowa's finds are sparse, suggesting the metal was exotic, restricted, maybe even sacred, a material charged with meaning, not just utility. And what's most humbling, there's no writing, no oral traditions recorded, no context that can tell us why that person was buried with that copper pin, just soil, silence, and metal that outlasted both. But if copper moved this far and mattered this much, what else might have traveled with it? Beliefs, rituals, styles, languages, or perhaps something more ceremonial still, a mortuary tradition that touched Iowa's sacred ground, leaving behind red pigment and grave goods, but no clear cultural label. Just a copper-bearing culture whose presence lingers like a fingerprint smudged in the soil. 29. Red ochre culture touches Iowa. It begins with a color, a deep, rusty red, the hue of iron oxide ground into powder, mixed with water, maybe fat, maybe blood, and spread onto the dead like a second skin. We call it red ochre, but it wasn't just pigment, it was purpose, a symbol, a ritual act performed thousands of years ago by people whose names, languages, and lives have all been lost, except for this one stubborn trace they left behind. And in northeastern Iowa, that trace remains, just barely. Red ochre is not a single culture so much as a phenomenon, a widespread mortuary tradition that emerged during the late Archaic period, roughly 3000 to 1000 BCE, spanning the Great Lakes, the upper Mississippi Valley, and the interior Midwest. It's marked by distinctive burial practices, flexed or extended inhumations, liberal use of red ochre pigment, and grave offerings that include copper tools, shell beads, exotic stones, and sometimes animal parts. And for a long time, Iowa seemed to sit just outside that footprint, close but not quite included, until the evidence started showing up. Scattered sites in northeast Iowa, particularly in the Driftless area, have turned up burials that fit the red ochre profile, not in dramatic numbers, not in clear, unmistakable cemeteries, but enough to suggest contact, enough to question boundaries. The finds are subtle: a burial in a mound with ochre staining, a copper awl beside a skeleton, shell ornaments from far away, and crucially, stratigraphic layers that place these remains in the Archaic period, older than woodland, younger than Paleo-Indian, culturally ambiguous, temporally slippery. What does it mean? Some archaeologists argue that these are outliers, evidence of minor trade or influence rather than direct participation in the red ochre tradition. Others see them as proof that the cultural zone was more fluid than previously thought, that the lines we draw between regions and traditions are our own inventions, neat boxes applied to messy organic realities. And then there's the question of identity. Who were these people? Red ochre groups didn't leave behind cities, monuments, or pottery traditions that we can easily classify. Their material culture is sparse. Their campsites are elusive. Most of what we know comes from their burials, carefully arranged, often elaborate, and deeply symbolic. The use of ochre appears to have spiritual meaning, perhaps marking a return to the earth, a transition, a protective layer between the living and the afterlife. And in Iowa, those meanings become even more mysterious. Were these full members of the red ochre culture, or local groups borrowing the rights of powerful neighbors? Was the pigment symbolic of something local, something tied to Iowa's landscape, soil, or stone? The problem, of course, is context. Most of the burials were found long ago, before modern excavation standards, and often by accident. Construction projects, farmers, erosion. Documentation is patchy. Artifacts are scattered in museum drawers, and many sites have since been destroyed or reburied, their secrets sealed once more. Still, the presence of red ochre elements in Iowa cannot be dismissed. They're not accidents, they're echoes of a cultural network that stretched farther and deeper than we once believed. And that network may have included not just rites and pigments, but people themselves, moving through Iowa, leaving traces in the soil and stone, touching lives and landscapes in ways we've only begun to map. But if red ochre is the ceremonial brushstroke across ancient Iowa's spiritual canvas, the next discovery would paint an even stranger picture: a burial site that was once believed to date from the Ice Age, only to be dramatically redated. The bodies remained the same, but the story shifted almost overnight. 30. Turin Man redated. Once upon a time, by which we mean 1955, a farmer in Monona County, Iowa, stumbled across human remains while digging along the Soldier River near the small town of Turin. The discovery set off immediate excitement. The skeletons buried in a sandy riverbank were thought to be incredibly old, perhaps dating back to the end of the Ice Age. For a moment, it seemed Iowa had its own Paleo-Indian burial site, a headline, a breakthrough. The remains became known as Turin Man, and for years they carried the weight of that label, offered up as the earliest human skeletons in Iowa, evidence of an Ice Age population long gone. But as is often the case with early archaeological interpretations, the story changed. New radiocarbon dating techniques applied decades later shifted the timeline dramatically. The Turin remains were not Paleo-Indian, not even early Archaic. They were Middle Archaic, probably around 5,000 to 6,000 years old, still ancient, still significant, but not Ice Age old, not Clovis old. The excitement dimmed, the mystery didn't. What the Turin site actually represents is something just as valuable, if less cinematic: a multi-bodied burial, possibly a small cemetery, preserved in an unusual context. The remains included at least 4 individuals, adults and children, buried in sandy, eroding soil without grave goods, no copper, no ochre, no ornaments, just bones, positions, and one stubborn fact: they were buried with care. The lack of artifacts makes interpretation tricky. Were these high status individuals stripped of their belongings by time or looters, or were they part of a tradition that didn't emphasize grave goods? Was the burial group familial, ceremonial, victims of disease, conflict, or something more mundane? We don't know, but their placement, intact, deliberate, suggests intentional burial, not haphazard disposal. That alone is meaningful. Then there's the setting, a riverbank prone to flooding and erosion, not the safest place to enter the dead. Unless, of course, the landscape had different meaning then. Perhaps it was sacred. Perhaps the water symbolized something: passage, rebirth, cleansing. Or perhaps it was simply convenient, soft ground, easy digging, a good view of the river. Even today, the Turin site remains vulnerable. Seasonal flooding has damaged parts of it. Other nearby sites have been lost to plowing and development. The story of Turin man and woman and child now depends on the preservation of what little remains and the re-examination of what was once thought to be settled. The biggest shift, though, is conceptual. This isn't a story of Ice Age survival. It's a story of Middle Archaic life, deep time, but not distant in human time. People who lived, buried their dead, and moved on. No pyramids, no copper, just memory, soil, and stillness. And somewhere not far from where they rested, other groups were building something more visible: mounds along
Ridgelines perfectly aligned and strangely grouped. Their purpose? Unknown. Their architects? Anonymous. But their presence? Unmistakable. 31. Slind Mounds Prairie Group. Up on a high ridge overlooking the upper Iowa River Valley, where wind ripples the tall grass and white pines keep quiet watch, there's a place that doesn't quite fit the landscape. It looks serene, natural, untouched, but scattered along the ridge are raised earth forms, some barely noticeable, others unmistakably artificial. Mounds, not one or two, a whole group, quietly holding secrets beneath the sod. This is the Slind Mounds Prairie Group, one of northeastern Iowa's most enigmatic archaeological sites. Located in Allamakee County within a restored prairie preserve, the site includes more than 30 mounds, conical, linear, and possibly effigy in form. Their arrangement isn't random, but it isn't entirely uniform either. The mounds stretch across the ridgetop, framed by bluffland forest on one side and river valley on the other, a dramatic setting, a sacred one perhaps. What makes Slind so haunting isn't just the number of mounds, it's how little we know about who built them, when, and why. Archaeologists suspect these mounds were constructed during the late woodland period, sometime between 500 and 1200 CE. That's the default answer. Late woodland is the fallback cultural tag for mound building traditions in the Midwest that aren't clearly linked to Hopewell or Mississippian cultures. It's a safe assumption based on shape, location, and stratigraphy, but Slind doesn't hand over its secrets easily. No large-scale excavations have been done at the site. Some test units, sure, surface surveys, aerial imaging, but the mounds themselves remain largely undisturbed, and that's by design. The area is now a protected natural area, a rare fragment of Iowa's pre-settlement prairie, and archaeologists are reluctant to dig into it unless absolutely necessary. A noble restraint, but one that preserves mystery as much as it preserves heritage. What we do know: some of the mounds likely contain burials, others may have been ceremonial markers. The linear mounds, longer and more ridge-like, might have marked processional paths, territorial boundaries, or astronomical alignments. No one agrees, and that's the point. Unlike Effigy Mound's national monument just a few counties away, Slinde lacks dramatic bear or bird shapes. If effigies exist here, they're subtle.
eroded, symbolic in ways we no longer understand. Some mound builders constructed animal shapes visible from above, others worked in geometry. Some, it seems, built for the sake of placement itself, the landscape chosen carefully for viewshed, symbolism, or unseen spiritual logic. The setting of Slind is perhaps its most telling feature. This ridge isn't just high, it's prominent. It overlooks a convergence zone where tributaries meet, where bluffs rise steeply from floodplain, where the sky feels impossibly close. It's the kind of place you choose for the things that matter, for ceremonies, for the dead, for messages not meant for the living, and yet we don't even know who they were. The late woodland label doesn't give us culture names. It doesn't tell us if these people were ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, the Dakota, the Iowa, or some unrecorded group whose language never survived contact. We don't know what the mounds were called. We don't know what they were for. What we do know is that someone, centuries ago, shaped the earth on this prairie ridge with care and repetition. Someone carried soil in baskets or hides over and over to raise these forms above the grass. Someone watched the sky while doing it. Someone remembered these mounds for a while and then forgot them until we found them again. And somewhere nearby, whether by trade or ritual, other groups were carving tools, shaping ornaments, and leaving behind artifacts of red stone. Not the famed catlinite from Minnesota, something else, something local, something harder to trace, but just as charged with meaning. 32. Pipestone sourcing to northwest Iowa. Red stone has always carried weight, not just literal weight, but symbolic gravity, power, status, connection. Across the indigenous cultures of North America, pipestone has been carved into effigies, ornaments, pipes, and ceremonial items for thousands of years. And for just as long, people have assumed one thing, that the source of this sacred stone was always elsewhere. Usually that elsewhere means Minnesota, specifically the famous catlinite quarries near Pipestone National Monument. The stone there is fine-grained, soft, easily carved, and distinctly red. It's been used for centuries by Plains and Midwestern peoples, and its distribution network is well documented, but recent research suggests an uncomfortable possibility. Some redstone artifacts found at Oneota and Mill Creek sites in northwest Iowa might not have come from Minnesota at all. They might have come from Iowa. That's right. Red pipestone sources in northwest Iowa, long dismissed, overlooked, or simply unknown, may have provided the material for artifacts once assumed to be imported. If true, this changes how we understand trade, movement, and cultural interaction in the region. It suggests local quarrying, local carving, local meaning, but confirming this is tricky, very tricky. Geochemical sourcing is the tool of choice, specifically techniques like neutron activation analysis and X-ray fluorescence, RF. These methods allow researchers to fingerprint stone, matching artifacts to their geological source based on mineral content and elemental composition, and preliminary results show that not all red pipestone artifacts from Iowa match catlinite. Some match stone found near the Little Sioux River, some from as far west as the Loess Hills. Others are still unclassified. This opens up a whole new layer of inquiry. Were there localized pipestone quarries operating alongside or independent of the Minnesota source? Did Iowa groups carve their own stone, reserving Minnesota catlinite for special imports or elite items? Or did the preference vary by community, era, or function? Even more intriguing is the idea that different pipestones may have held different meanings. Maybe it wasn't just about material availability, but about spiritual geography. Maybe Iowa pipestone was tied to certain clans, stories, or ancestral places, while catlinite carried a different significance. Whatever the case, these new findings disrupt the neat narrative of long-distance trade as the sole pipeline for ceremonial stone in prehistoric Iowa. It wasn't just about receiving materials from faraway sacred places. Sometimes the sacred place was underfoot, unmarked, unmined, misunderstood. Of course, the next challenge is preservation. Many possible quarry sites in Iowa lie on private land. Others have been lost to agriculture, erosion, or simple anonymity. Unlike the dramatic quarries at Pipestone, these local sources aren't tourist attractions. They're ditches, ravines, sandstone ledges quietly weeping red in the rain. And if those sources vanish, so too does our ability to understand the full picture, to grasp the way prehistoric Iowans viewed stone not just as a material, but as a memory, something they could shape, carry, and pass on. But just as one tradition fades into silence, another begins to stir, the story of a cultural turning point, a shift, a transformation, a moment in Iowa's deep past when everything changed and a culture called Great Oasis gave way to something new, something more connected to Mississippian influences, and something that still refuses to fully explain itself.
33. Great Oasis. Oneota transitions. You can almost hear it, a cultural gear shift, faint but definite, rumbling somewhere in the centuries between 900 and 1100 CE. One tradition winds down, another begins to stir, not with a bang, but with a pivot, a redirection of priorities, a retooling of landscapes, economies, and belief systems. It's a story archaeologists know by two names, Great Oasis and Oneota, and the space between them is one of Iowa's most puzzling prehistoric mysteries. Great Oasis people were village dwellers, semi-sedentary. Their communities appeared around 900 CE across central and northwestern Iowa, sometimes alongside rivers, sometimes tucked into uplands. They farmed maize and squash, they hunted, they lived in earth lodges and cooked with grit-tempered pottery, simple vessels, thick-walled and plain, but unmistakably theirs. They buried their dead nearby. They were relatively small-scale and locally focused. Then something changed. By around 1050 CE, those villages started to disappear. Not vanish exactly, but evolve, mutate, reassemble under a new cultural banner. Oneota. And Oneota, compared to Great Oasis, was a different beast. Bigger settlements, shell-tempered pottery, longhouse-style dwellings, a wider range of food sources, more regional interaction, more ritual complexity, and perhaps most importantly, stronger ties to the wider Mississippian world, including places like Cahokia, the immense city on the Mississippi that, at its peak, dwarfed anything in the region. So what happened in Iowa? What caused Great Oasis to shift into Oneota? And why does the archaeological record for that transformation feel like a black box? Let's start with the obvious. Timing. The collapse or transformation of Great Oasis culture aligns almost perfectly with the rise of Cahokia's influence in the greater Mississippi River Basin. This isn't coincidence. Something was radiating outward from Cahokia, not empire necessarily, but ideas, styles, practices, perhaps religions, perhaps corn, perhaps stories too. We know that certain Oneota traits, particularly in ceramics and settlement planning, appear to reflect Mississippian inspiration, not direct colonization, but cultural gravity, the kind that pulls neighboring societies into new alignments whether they want it or not. So one theory goes like this. Great Oasis was pulled into that orbit. The culture changed, the names changed, the traditions blended, a new hybrid emerged. But that theory raises other questions. If the Great Oasis people were so affected by Mississippian influence, why did they retain so many differences? Why didn't they adopt more Mississippian traits like platform mounds, maize-dominated diets, or the southeastern ceremonial complex imagery found elsewhere? And why is the archaeological evidence for the actual transition so thin? This is the heart of the mystery. In most areas where cultures change, you find transitional layers, zones of hybrid, pottery, mixed architecture,
fused burial styles. But in Iowa, the boundary between Great Oasis and Oneota feels sharp, abrupt, almost like a break. That could mean population movement, groups moving in and replacing locals, but it could also mean internal revolution, a generation that rejected the old ways and rewrote their cultural script from the inside out. We don't know. We're left with fragments, post holes, potsherds, burned corn, bone piles, and it's not just about material culture. The transition represents a change in worldview. Great Oasis people lived in small, scattered communities. Oneota settlements were often larger, denser, and more networked. Their economies were broader, their ceremonial practices more visible, their tools more standardized. It feels like a civilization standing up taller, but it also feels like a response to pressure, environmental, political, or ideological. Climate change, resource competition, the allure or threat of Cahokia's economic engine, all possibilities. The irony is that while Oneota culture rose in complexity, it still refused to fully become Mississippian. It stayed Iowa rooted, local, familiar, even as it changed. The transition wasn't a surrender to outside influence, it was a remix, and that's where we're left. At the end of the Great Oasis tradition, watching a new culture step into its place, not as a conqueror, but as an inheritor of the same fields, the same rivers, the same winds. Only the names have changed. The questions, however, remain. And now that we've traced all three mysteries across earth, bone, fire, ice, stone, and silence, there's only one place left to go.